I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. You know, I really want to shorten this a lot, but he's so impressive it's kind of hard to. Treasurer Mourdock was elected to Indiana State Treasurer in 2006. He was reelected in 2010, leading the Republican ticket with at least 62% of the vote. As Treasurer, Richard has been an integral part of the state's fiscal health. His leadership earned over $1 billion in investment income for taxpayers and successfully expanded the state's college savings plan. At the same time, his office has returned an average of 10% of his budget back to the Treasury every year. He is known nationwide, this is the most impressive to me, for courage, for leading the legal fight to challenge the Obama administration's illegal bailout and the takeover of Chrysler. Richard took this case all the way to the United States Supreme Court on behalf of Indiana pensioners. His courageous efforts were featured in articles by George Will, the Wall Street Journal, as well as Fox News and other media outlets. I am very pleased and honored to introduce our speaker this evening, Indiana Treasurer Richard Mourdock.
And I'm glad you got to stand up, not for what you just did there, but for the two award winners. Because I know the room's kind of tight, it's getting a little cramped. I'm glad you got to stand up. You know, this is, well, let me put it this way. I think not the most recent time prior to tonight, but the last time I was in Madison was about 2 weeks before the election, and we were down on the riverfront, and the wind was blowing over the river. It was gray and overcast, and it was misting and raining, and it was 50 degrees, and it felt like 30. And I was down there today, it was the same thing. It's amazing to me. Well, I am so pleased to be with you tonight. I sense the excitement in this room. What you all did last fall was truly historic, and I have no doubt that, as was said at this microphone earlier, the full effect of it is not going to be felt over the next few weeks, months, but over years, decades, and maybe even generations. Because our philosophy is different than the Democrats. Let me give you just one example. My wife and I have come here from our home in Darmstadt. We've come to Madison a couple times and stay here, and we stay over in Vive. We do the B&B thing, and we love coming to this town, and we like to spend our tourist dollars here. By contrast, Democrats like to spend their tourist dollars in Urbana, Illinois. As you all get ready, and by the way, I am so impressed with the candidates who came here tonight. I mean, I say this in honesty and full sincerity. I get to hear at meetings like this, I'm actually speaking in 38 Lincoln Day dinners this year. I hear that old. Although understand, chickens do quake at the sound of my name. And I did have the beef tonight. Yeah. But I love to go to Lincoln Day dinners when the county organizations do what you all did tonight. Because yes, I'm honored to be a keynote speaker, but it's more important that you hear from the people in your local community who are running for local office and the quality of those candidates. Leadership's first role is communication. And every one of the people who stood here over the last hour are so confident in what they're doing, they obviously believe in what they believe, that they can stand here and very articulately make that argument as to why you should support them. And I think your entire community, your entire party deserves a round of applause for generating that kind of. And before I hit the speech, which I will abbreviate a bit, as a guy from Darmstadt, Indiana, when I set out on the campaign trail to cover the state, literally it is true, sometimes it takes me 5.5 hours from my home in Darmstadt just to get to other places in Indiana. You would have the same thing here, of course, if you headed off to South Bend or Lake County or Lincoln County. I mean, it's hard if you're from southern Indiana to get across the whole state and get known. And so you have to have a lot of folks help you in a campaign. And I will tell you, when you're from one corner of the state and you drive to another corner of the state and you see your yard signs up and you know there are people in that community working on your behalf, it makes you feel very good. So Pam Newhouse, thank you very much for being my coordinator. Pam and I met at a women's club meeting shortly, I don't know when it was. I guess it was in the spring. It was the election season was really beginning last year, and we found out we both have a mutual love of history. And that's what I want to share with you tonight. You know, I love American history. I don't think I'd be in this business if I didn't. But I want to talk a little bit about the two people for whom this dinner is named tonight, Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Reagan. You know, for many years, almost 35 years now, I've given myself the goal, just as I've laid out each night, to pick up a history book and try to read 10 pages of American history. I haven't done it every night, but I've done it most nights. And the more I do that, the more I become fascinated with that middle part of the 19th century and Mr. Lincoln. And yet, just this past February, February 6th, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the birth of Ronald Reagan. And with the Lincoln Day season coming up, I decided, you know, I think I'll do this year's speeches on Ronald Reagan. And then the more I thought of it, I found the fascinating, at least fascinating to me, parallels between those two great Republican presidents. And so I want to share some of them. Some of them you've probably heard, some of you perhaps have not heard. But I think they're fascinating. You know, one thing, let's start with, yeah, they both had a heritage to Illinois. Pretty simple. We like to think Lincoln grew up here. He did from the age of 7 to 21. We can claim him as a Hoosier. And by the way, make no mistake, it was Indiana that made Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln that made Illinois, in that order. I'd like to think those Democrat representatives shared that thinking over there in their band, but I doubt that they did. But of course, Ronald Reagan was born in Illinois. Born in Tampico and raised in Dixon. At the age of 21, Abraham Lincoln moved to Illinois, and really most people associate him with that state. Both of them claim their political philosophy came from being from this region of the country. Both of them, and I find this interesting, had a very difficult relationship with their fathers. If you don't know, Thomas Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln really didn't get along all that well. Thomas Lincoln was known as a very strict person. He was a strict Baptist. That's why they moved out of Kentucky to come to Indiana. He didn't want his children raised where slavery was present. Kentucky was a slave state. And as often happens, strong-willed sons and strong-willed fathers start the headbutting. And so it seemed it happened between Thomas and Abraham Lincoln. Thomas Lincoln wanted his son to be what he was, which he thought of was the ideal American, the ideal Westerner, that sod-breaking prairie farmer. Abraham Lincoln, no. He worked hard, but he didn't like hard work. He wanted to use his mind. Thomas Lincoln, I have no doubt, was very upset when he heard his son want to be a lawyer, because he didn't think that was the right way to work. In fact, late in his life, when they were living about 60 miles apart, which at that time wasn't all that far, Abraham Lincoln received word that his father was seriously ill and he ought to go down and see him because it may be his last chance to talk to him. He didn't go. Refused to go. They were estranged. And so he never saw his father again. Ronald Reagan and his father, not very close either. You see, Jack Reagan was a shoe salesman, and he was really close to something beyond his family. It was something that comes out of a bottle. He was an alcoholic. Years later, Ronald Reagan's brother said that their father often embarrassed the entire family. They moved from town to town in Illinois because Jack Reagan couldn't hold a job because of his drinking. Ultimately, Ronald Reagan bought a home once he was successful, bought a home for his father and mother. He was very close to his mother, but his father not so much. Both of them had very humble, when you think where they ended up in life, they had very humble educational backgrounds. And I find that particularly fascinating for Abraham Lincoln. You know, he is the most quoted person who has ever spoken the English language. That's pretty remarkable for a guy for whom there is no record he ever spent a single day in his life in what you and I would consider a formal classroom. Most quoted person who ever spoken the English language. He ultimately gave credit to his learning. He was self-taught largely, to the 3 B's. The Bible, the Blackstone Law Journals, and what he called the Bard. The Bard of Avon, William Shakespeare. He loved to read the works of Shakespeare. He would quote long sections at cabinet meetings. He used to drive his cabinet off sometimes. You know, Todd will tell you, one of the things they still do today in the United States Congress, when you become a congressman, as Abraham Lincoln did in 1847, he served 1 term in the United States Congress. One of the first things that you do as a congressman, I'm told, is the Library of Congress sends you over a form you fill out, and you have to put your resume on it, and it's recorded in the U.S. Library of Congress for all of history to know the backgrounds of every person who served in the Congress. You can picture Abraham Lincoln kind of standing in line behind those other new congressmen who are being brought into the room, and they're filling out the form, and next to that word education, it says education : and some of them are writing Harvard. Some of them wrote Dartmouth. King's College, the predecessor to Columbia University. You know what Abraham Lincoln wrote next to the word education? Insufficient. He was very embarrassed by his lack of education. It's really remarkable when you think of all that he did. Ronald Reagan, a product of public schools where he frankly wasn't all that good of a student. He went off to little Eureka College, couldn't get any kind of academic scholarship, had to work his way through college. And there he was a so-so student. By the way he worked his way through college, he had a job washing dishes in the women's dormitory. Said later it was the best job he ever had. Graduated with a degree in economics, the only president of the United States with a degree in economics. Couldn't we use him now? Educational backgrounds that really wouldn't have seemed to lead to the White House. How about their career paths? Well, you might be thinking, Lincoln was a lawyer. Of course, all kinds of lawyers end up as president. And that's true. And that's the kind of lawyer Abraham Lincoln was. Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer who was never, ever going to be serving on the United States Supreme Court. That's not the kind of law he practiced at all. In fact, while he was a very prosperous lawyer, his law practice was such that if he were alive today practicing that type of law, you would see him advertising on television. And his commercial would begin with these words. Have you been injured in an accident? A few years ago, Professor, I think it's James Dirk, I may be wrong on the first name. Professor James Dirk from Anderson University wrote a wonderful book called Lincoln the Lawyer. He sent a team of graduate students into every courthouse in the state of Illinois where Abraham Lincoln had ever practiced. They found over 6,000 cases that he had been entered into. And over 2/3 of them, more than 4,000, were simple debt collection cases. He wasn't on the leading edge of practicing law. He was a debt collection lawyer. Ronald Reagan, how about that career path? Hollywood? Are you kidding me? Seriously? Ronald Reagan, as an actor, was at best kind of a B actor. He was, again, prosperous. He wasn't the top billing. He was making a living until he forgot the first rule of acting, which is you never go on stage, you never go on screen with a child or a cute animal. They'll always steal the scene, right? The late 1950s, he did a movie called Bedtime for Bonzo, and his co-star was a chimpanzee. And at that point, his career was pretty well over. He could no longer be taken seriously.